Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the joint Oireachtas Committee on Housing, Local Government and Heritage. Today we commence pre-legislative scrutiny on the general scheme of the Marine Protected Areas Bill, and we're joined in committee this morning from the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage by Mr Richard Cronin, Principal Advisor for the Marine Environment, Dr Oliver O'Kyle and Dr Tim O'Higgins, Scientific Policy Advisors, and Mr Conall O'Connor, the Assistant Principal Officer. And members have been circulated with your opening statement, and we were also circulated with the general scheme of the bill, which I think was published back mid-December. Just read a quick note on privilege before we commence. I should remind members of the constitutional requirement they must be physically present within the confines of the place where the Parliament has chosen to sit, namely Leinster House, in order to participate in public meetings. For those attending in the committee room, you're protected by absolute privilege in respect of your contributions to today's meetings. This means that you have an absolute defence against any defamation action for anything you say at the meeting. But members and witnesses are expected not to abuse the privilege they enjoy, and it's my duty as chair to ensure this privilege is not abused. Therefore, if your statements are potentially defamatory in relation to an identifiable person or entity, you'll be directed to discontinue your remarks. It's imperative that you comply with any such direction, and members and witnesses are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. And the order we're going to follow is probably going to chop and change a little bit because members have to go to questions in the Dáil, and we'll have to swap out. I'll have to vacate the chair just temporarily, but we'll make sure everybody gets plenty of time. And I'd like to invite Mr Cronin to make your opening statement, please.
Thank you very much and good morning. My name is Richard Cronin. I'm the Principal Advisor for the Marine Environment in the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. I'm joined today by my colleagues Dr Oliver O'Kyle and Dr Tim O'Higgins, Scientific Policy Advisors, and Mr Conall O'Connor, Assistant Principal Officer. Marine Protected Areas, MPAs, are a key measure to ensure that we have a healthy, productive and sustainably used marine environment. They are important tools to achieve the objectives of the EU Marine Strategy Framework Directive, the OSPAR Convention for Protection of the Marine Environment of the North East Atlantic, for which my section has national responsibility. Ireland's programme for government commits to achieving 30% MPA coverage by 2030, in line with the European Biodiversity Strategy and the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. The area of Ireland's seas and ocean that is currently under area-based protection stands at just over 8%. We have a long way to go to meet our national commitments. Ireland has, up until now, relied mainly on the EU Birds and Habitats directives to provide area-based protection in the marine environment. We've lacked the legislative tools to go beyond protecting the habitats, species and features listed in those directives. As a result, many marine habitats and species, including critically endangered species such as the angel shark and important sensitive habitats such as coastal seagrass beds or cold water coral gardens, have not had sufficient legislative protection. In order to address this issue in 2019, an expert group was asked to provide independent advice on how best to expand Ireland's network of MPAs. The main findings of their 2020 report were the need for new primary legislation to address this legislative gap, the need for full and meaningful participation in the design, production and delivery of MPAs, the need to establish suitable structures for the effective management of MPAs. These findings received resounding public support, 99%, in a subsequent consultation in 2022. It's important to note that, in general, MPAs do not have to be wholly sterile environments with no activity. They should instead be managed to achieve specific conservation objectives. Activities may be permitted within them so long as they are sustainable and compatible with the MPA conservation objectives. However, the proposed legislation will allow for the possibility of highly protected MPAs where no human activities are permitted. The general scheme presented here today attempts to translate these findings into a legal instrument. The goal has been to produce a scheme for modern environmental legislation to protect biodiversity, mitigate against climate change, and to promote ecosystem-based management in the marine environment. We've also worked closely with the Office of the Attorney General in developing the general scheme. I'll now briefly detail the main features of the general scheme. The general scheme is divided into three parts. The first part includes title, definitions, and application. These are standard provisions. Part 2 contains the main substance of the proposed bill, and I'll briefly touch upon its main features. The Ocean Environment Policy Statement, described in Head 6, will, amongst other things, set the priorities for MPA designations. This will enable the process to focus, for example, on specific geographic areas, on particular species or ecosystem processes, or on particular site characteristics such as size, resilience, or connectivity. Participation is at the heart of the general scheme. This includes participation in the identification of features and species for protection in Head 7, and in the development of MPA proposals, their management objectives and measures in Head 8. The scheme provides for an independent scientific and technical and socio-economic advisory body referred to as the expert body in Head 16. This will be supported by a secretariat and will advise the Minister on designation and effective management of MPAs. It provides for working groups to directly support this expert body as required. This will ensure a flexible structure for effective participation that will facilitate MPA design, which can be applied equally in busy coastal and remote offshore areas. The scheme also gives the Minister powers to appoint management authorities in Head 11 and provides for emergency powers of MPA designation in the case of man-made or natural disasters in Head 12. It also makes provision for rapid identification of areas to facilitate climate adaptation in Head 13. Part 3 of the general scheme includes the details of the duties of authorised personnel and of the prosecution of offences. It also provides for a regular review of the legislation to ensure that it remains fit for purpose. With almost 500,000 square kilometres of highly valued marine territory, Ireland has a national obligation and a global responsibility to protect and conserve marine biodiversity and the extraordinary resources and benefits which marine ecosystems provide. I believe that this general scheme provides a basis for the legal structures that are needed to deliver MPA designation and management and to promote meaningful participation in the process for people and for nature. I look forward to hearing the views of the committee on the proposed general scheme and to answer any questions arising. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cronin. And I think this is a hugely important piece of legislation, and I'm delighted to see it come forward. And we have 2 more sessions after this, next Tuesday and next Thursday, where we'll be meeting with fishers. We're going to look at community engagement. We're also bringing in some industry representatives as well, and then we will meet the Irish Environmental Network and the environmental NGOs. But I think this has been well overdue. As you mentioned, we had a very, very small amount, only about 2.3% protected, and that was under SAC and SPAs. And this legislation is absolutely necessary because we do depend on that sea area. Our energy, most of our energy in the future is going to come from out there. It's going to come under pressure from that. Our fishers, as we know, are under a lot of pressure as it is, and all those coastal communities that depend on the tourism and the recreation aspect of it as well. And not to mention the climate function of a functioning marine ecosystem. So it's critically important, and I think a lot of people ignore it a lot of the time because it's just out there, it's just the sea, we wouldn't be aware of the detail of it, and it's far away. It's probably not as obvious, the damage that has been done to our marine environment, as the terrestrial damage that's been done, because that's visible and we see it every day. So I'm going to move now to the members for questions, and I think we can allow a little bit more than the 7 minutes, and as I said, we'll adapt as people need to come and go. So I'll move first to, I think it's Deputy O'Brien. I think you're first, please.
Thank you very much, and Richard and the team, thank you very much for coming in. First of all, just like the Chair, just to welcome the publication of the general scheme. Our view is this is enormously important, and the sooner this progresses in the right direction, I think the better for all of us. It is much delayed, and many of us were of the view that it would have been better if this was introduced in parallel with the offshore planning regime, but we are where we are, so we'll work with the timelines in front of us. Just to say, because I think many of us will probably have even more questions for the department after we've gone through the 3 sessions, it might be helpful, Chair, if a private briefing with the officials at the latter end of the PLS is facilitated, just for us to go through more kind of technical things and just to put that on the record. So look, I have a long list of questions. I'm going to rattle through them very quickly. Unfortunately, I have to go out for oral questions with the Minister, and I'll come back in. And maybe if the questions I ask aren't dealt with, if written replies can be given to the committee at some stage, that would be great. So I'll run through them very quickly and let you have as much time as possible to go through. Head 5 and Head 16, the expert body. It's not completely clear from the general scheme who is likely to be on this, exactly what it's going to be doing, what will be the process of selection, and why such wide discretion appears to be given in the general scheme to the Minister in terms of setting it up and giving its direction. So can you give us more information on the kind of who, what and when of the expert body? Head 6, I have 2 questions. Similarly with the Ocean Environmental Policy Statement, who's going to develop it, over what period of time, in consultation with who, how is it going to relate to the other policy statements that we're getting under the Maritime Area Plan and the framework that was agreed by the Oireachtas previously. 6.4, the language on the 10% and the 30% is exceptionally weak. I mean, my understanding is we were meant to hit the 10% in 2010. It's not an option, it's an obligation under EU law, and we've missed that. Likewise, my understanding is that 30% by 2030 is an obligation. So, you know, to reach the 10% as soon as practicable, to reach up to 30% by 2030, why is that softer language than is required under EU law? And what would be the consequences, for example, of us missing the 30% designation by 2030 in terms of EU enforcement actions, etc.? Head 7 and Head 11, designation. Can you give us as much information as you can in terms of what you think the time frame will be, but also what's going to happen while the designation process is underway? There's no discussion, for example, of pending designations or interim designations, which I understand have been used in other jurisdictions, and I'm keen on that. Head 14, probably one of the heads and subheads I'm most concerned about, which is 5A, existing authorisations. There does seem to be a kind of a suggestion that where an existing authorisation or consent is in place, and even if after the designation process takes place, the activity which is authorised under licence or consent does not comply with the conservation objectives in the designation order, the Minister can allow those activities to continue. Obviously, it sets out in 5A1 and 2 the circumstances. Can you just confirm that this does mean that there is a provision that if, for example, the designation process concludes on the basis of scientific evidence that location A shouldn't have certain types of activity or those activities will damage marine biodiversity, but where government decides, as per the sub A's and B's there, that there's an overriding economic interest, like, for example, meeting our wind energy targets, that the latter will trump the former, and we could be in a situation where marine biodiversity could be sacrificed in the interest of, for example, meeting our energy efficiency targets. I mean, that's essentially what that provision is as I read it, and can you confirm if that's the case or not? Head 15, enforcement authorities. Can you give us more information about this, particularly in terms of the Navy and the extent to which they have the capacity and the ability to deal with environmental and biodiversity enforcement? Clearly they can enforce people infringing areas where they shouldn't be, but there's a lot more to enforcement than that. And why is there no role in conjunction with the Navy for the Marine Institute, for example, to do all of that? I'm confused about the management authorities, just from the head, so if you can clarify what they're going to do and why. Monitoring, there's a whole series of issues around what is to be monitored, how often, is it the network, is it individual marine protected areas, who will do it and what are the resources for that. Head 21, 22, authorised persons, I just don't understand it, so maybe if you can provide some clarity. And then I don't see any mention of restoration, so as we go through the designation process, what about those parts of our marine area that have been badly damaged by existing activities, and is there a mechanism or process by which restoration then can be introduced in the designation process? Thanks, Chair.
Mr. Cronin.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Deputy, for those questions. There's a lot to get through there. I will see if I can, I'll try and take them one at a time. So in relation to I think your first question was on the expert body and its composition. So the thought process behind this is that with the power to designate, there will need to be based on some sort of scientific evidence. And an expert scientific body is considered to be the best approach to doing that. And there's a limited amount of capacity of this expertise. So we have considered that the the establishment of this body with those life science skills, socioeconomic skills, and other skills that we have set out there, technical skills. We think that's the best way to do it. The Minister will be empowered to appoint that body, and it will then be able to allow participation through subordinate working groups as well, okay? And that body then will advise the Minister on designations, on processes, on procedures, and on issues like management recommendations and on monitoring. So various pieces of advice that have yet to be developed, and they will vary potentially from marine protected area to marine protected area designation proposal. That is, I think, all I can say on relation to the expert body. The Ocean Environment Policy Statement, I think, was your next question. So one of the things we're quite conscious of in the development of this is creating a wider policy context for what the ambitions are for marine protection in a given period. So the policy statements are envisaged to be revised at the latest every 6 years, okay? And this will allow us to articulate an overall vision for what we see as being necessary for the health of the ocean, but also then to set out those legitimate policies around sustainable use. So for food, for energy, for recreation, transport, communications, tourism. So all those different policies that are considered necessary and sustainable use policies need to also be set out, so that we can then set out a priority for what we want to protect. So we have already got scientific information about what is threatened and declining in the Irish marine space. So what sort of level of what will be our primary objectives? So will it be focusing on area coverage, or specific and unique ecosystem features, prioritising areas that might be identified as being suitable for offshore renewable energy in the first instance, so we could consider designations or the sensitivity of those areas first from a biodiversity point of view. So we would look at all those things in a policy statement, okay, and also mechanisms for participation.
And in terms of the drafting and approval of that policy statement, is it envisaged there would be a public participation element to it, an Oireachtas engagement? Over what period of time do you think it'll take to produce that policy statement? And what will its relationship be to the other kind of policy and mapping requirements, for example, under related legislation we've dealt with in the last 2 years?
So we have at the moment a National Marine Planning Framework, which is the overarching policy framework for the stewardship and sustainable use of the marine space. So the policy statement will have to articulate that, and a key feature of it will have to be the description of its relationship to that primary policy statement.
Sorry, I don't know the answer to this one, but here's what I can help with.
That's Alexa. Okay. So it will contain that information, okay, but also then specific priorities around marine protection. So who will draft it? We have commenced some work on this in the last month in my team, okay, where we've sat down and we've taken out a blank sheet of paper and said, what do we want to achieve with this? How would we describe it? So we could get some preliminary work done on this, okay? We think we can develop a policy statement on a non-statutory basis before the legislation is enacted, so that there's no delay in the commencement of the legislation. We will be engaging with all the relevant policy departments in relation to the sea. So we will be engaging with them in the coming months, and they've been notified of that as well. I understand that we intend to lay the policy statement before both houses. So I think that's the intention at this stage, okay? And it will then allow the group, the expert group, it will give it a framework within which to operate. We're acutely aware of the need to ensure that, one, there's participation in this process, and this isn't a top-down process. That's what the consultations have been explicit, and that's what best practice is. The second thing we're conscious of is that the state and the people of Ireland have a growing need and an increased need to get benefits from the sea. And we need to make sure that those benefits can proceed at the same time as providing biodiversity protection. So we need to, and we are blessed in Ireland with an abundance of space. So we have enough space to accommodate everything. But we need to make sure that when prioritising the designation space, we're aware of the other needs of the space as well, and avoid as much conflict as possible. Okay. Can I keep going through the other query?
Decision of the chair.
I'll try and cover the rest of them. So then the head 4, I think you mentioned this point around 10% as soon as practical. I think that's just text that it comes from the programme for government. It's just to hold it there, okay? It's the commitment to achieve 10% comes from the Convention on Biological Diversity. Ireland has missed that target. It's currently at 8.2, I think, % coverage. It's hoped that it will be achieved this year, I think. But the 30% target, I think you had a question then about what's the implication if we...
Well, the language is up to 30% rather than 30% by 2030, so that gives you some wriggle room. So I suppose, first of all, why that softer language, and what would be the implications, particularly from, say, an EU enforcement point of view, if we weren't to meet that 30% by 2030?
Okay, so I think that the 30% target at this point in the text is a target for us to reach in relation to what we believe is the commitment at the moment. It may be the case in future that that target is changed. Is there a legal implication for us? At the moment, there isn't, because it's a biodiversity strategy of the European Union. It's a policy commitment founded on scientific evidence, and it's in the programme for government. It's also part of the agreement for the post-2020 framework under the Convention on Biological Diversity. Looking into the future and the development of the European Union Nature Restoration Regulation, these targets will potentially become binding. So that's in the next year or two. So I think that we will end up finding ourselves looking at firmer and firmer targets. Okay. You had a question as well on designations under Head 7, whether they could be time limited.
The question was, what's the time frame? But also, while designation, that process is taking place, was there no consideration of pending designations or interim designations? So it's the overall timeline for the designation process, but also kind of interim measures. I mean, we had discussion, for example, when we were doing the planning legislation for the marine, that given that we have a series of legacy wind farm projects that now have their max and obviously are going to go for planning, we were asking about interim measures to ensure as that is happening, because we all want that renewable wind. Are there things that can be done? Because the marine protected areas designation process is likely to take, on evidence from other EU member states, several years between the establishment of the legislation, the designating bodies, the consultation, etc. Yeah. So in the meantime, to try and avoid that potentially negative trade-off of 14.5a, where we have to choose one or other, right? Yeah. Renewable energies or biodiversity. Are there interim measures, interim designations that could be considered? Was that considered in the drafting of the scheme?
Yeah, so we have we have a head in relation to what we're calling climate adaptation. So that is, I think, Head 13, which is the identification of sites. So this is the acceleration for that particular purpose. Okay, so that is a faster process that is envisaged. But also, if I go back to my comments in relation to the Ocean Environment Policy Statement, we can, in the Ocean Environment Policy Statement, prioritise, for example, those particular sites in the first instance, so that they are the first things that we look to. So there is a way to mitigate that, okay?
And could I just ask, so on head 13, in the explanatory note, it says, for example, rapid identification of areas which are not suitable for offshore renewable energy. That would assume, however, that, because obviously there has to be some assessment by government when the maritime area consents have been issued by the minister. That assumes that those sites are unlikely to cross head 13. These would be other sites, for example. Would that be a fair interpretation?
So could you repeat that?
Yeah, so if you go back to the legacy projects, again, one of the concerns, and this is not at all about opposition to renewable energy because that's something we all want, but given that those maritime area consents are in the process of or have been issued by the Minister for Environment, where head 13 talks about, for example, the rapid identification of areas that are not suitable for offshore renewable energy, I presume we're not talking about those areas where maritime area consents have or are about to be issued for those 7 legacy projects off the East Coast. It would be other areas, or am I wrong? Would it be possible, hypothetically, for this provision, the urgent area proposals, to apply to any of those legacy sites or portions of those legacy sites?
What I was going to say just before that was that what we've also endeavoured to do since December of last year in the acceleration of this work is we have commenced using the expert body that produced the advisory report. We have reconvened, the Minister's reconvened part of that to carry out that sensitivity analysis, an ecological sensitivity analysis on that eastern seaboard area in order to bring greater certainty to those sites and the avoidance of any conflict between their location and ecologically sensitive or unique features that may need protection as well. So that piece, that kind of mitigation piece is already in train with an aimed delivery of April of this year for that piece, okay? We think Head 13 could still be used for those designations, okay? But if we need them in the Irish Sea. Okay. Now, when I say all of this, I want to just add one caveat, which is that we're not looking at the birds and habitats directive studies, which are also taking place. There's still further work to take place on those potentially. So we're not. These are things outside of the birds and habitats directive. And what I mean by that are things like the OSPAR Convention has produced a list of threatened and declining species, some of which occur in the Irish marine space. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature has a red list of species and habitats. Again, so those are the sort of things that we're currently looking at. And that group is working quite a lot at the moment. I believe you may have a witness appearing next week from that group as well.
Okay, so
I have to step out for a
you
second.
have to step out, yes. We'll take Senator Boylan then, please.
Okay, and I will be brief, because not to make another extended excuse, but I've got to appear up in the Senate. So I hopefully there'll be other takers. I think there may be some online. Just briefly and quickly, I suppose I just want to say I want to welcome the officials here. I think this is a really, really important piece of legislation, and on a general look at the general scheme, I think it's very encouraging and it's all very, very positive. I've just got a few questions really to ask, and I'm going to paddle around the different heads, but the first one that comes to mind is Head 6, which deals with the Ocean Environment Policy Statement. And of course it says the Minister shall publish on the government website an ocean policy, the environmental policy statement. The purpose of this policy statement shall be to set the priorities for the protection of the marine environment, including priorities and targets for the designation of the marine protected areas that we'd be familiar with. I suppose, and again we know the standard language in terms of acknowledging international, European, national laws and treaties and all of that, that's a given. I'm somewhat surprised, and maybe I'm wrong, so correct me if I am, that in the proposal that the draft ocean environmental policy shall be available for public consultation for a period of 4 weeks. 4 weeks. Now, is that what is being proposed?
Well, it's what it says here, but yeah.
It says it here.
Yeah.
Just confirm.
Yeah.
What's the thought process behind that? 4 weeks. I'll just take that question first. Can you tease that out?
So I think you'll find that the time limit for this 4 weeks, and you'll see the time for that, and you'll see times in other parts of the bill. The draft general scheme is something that we have identified ourselves as needing to be mapped out. What we're trying to achieve is to bring some sort of certainty to the commencement of this work. Okay, so there is a balance between having a time period and a meaningful time period, and I think that maybe, Senator, is the point you're aiming at here.
Well, the 4 weeks from the date of the publication of the ocean environmental policy. So it's too short. It's far too short.
Yeah.
And in terms of engagement, and I want you to take that away and think about it, because I'd be rigorously opposing it, I have to say, because I don't think it's right. And I think the Minister shall revise the draft, and then the next piece to follow on from that. So you go out to this public consultation for 4 weeks, far too tight. You've got to notify people, you've got to engage people. It depends when the timing is, time of year. There's a whole lot of factors that could shorten that period for some. And then it says, if necessary and appropriate, the Minister shall revise the draft ocean environmental policy statement to take into account any relevant consideration arising from the public consultation. So what's the degree of certainty around it? I hope it's not a meaningless exercise that people are going to send in submissions in this consultation. And the Minister has full discretion, if he considers it necessary, to accept or reject, or to accept, amend or reject that principle. And I think it's a bit watery, to be honest with you, and I'd like a bit more certainty on that. So I just want to flag these issues, really. It's not an issue of, we're only engaging here, you know, and I just want to flag that. The area of public participation, a lot of talk about public participation, and I think that's important. But can you give me an example? Just tease out of prescribed bodies. You'd be familiar with the prescribed bodies like Ontashko and other environmental groups that would be referred in the built heritage, for instance. It's a requirement to refer applications and development and proposals for those, be they in architectural conservation areas or marine sensitive areas. What's your view in relation to prescribed bodies? Where are they in all of this? Now, I know you've listed other groups, but I don't see the prescribed bodies like Ontashka, which would be, and they tend to be, some of these tend to be sort of voluntary. They're funded, of course, by state funding, but they have a voluntary element in them and they have a community participation in them. Can you tease that out for me?
Yeah, so if I could just close off on the timing on this, we'll take note of that. Thank you. Yeah. And it's a piece of work that we have identified ourselves as needing to be done in the general scheme, sorting out the timelines, but thank you for bringing that to our attention as well. In relation to participation, before I address your issue on the prescribed bodies, from our advice from the experts, from our own professional expert experience, and from the feedback from the public consultation, consultation is seen by many as not being sufficient. So participation, which is quite challenging to turn into something in legal language, but participation, we feel, in the development of the whole process is essential for its success, not only in the identification of things to protect, but also in the development of the overall site designation. So and that's not just experts, it's also communities, those bodies you talk about, both prescribed and non-prescribed.
Right.
Okay, industry, okay, sectors, they will all, I believe, need to participate. In our consultation process, the one thing that the sectors told us was, we have no problem with the policy or the objective, we want to be involved. So I think to answer the question, we will be able to include those bodies in the participatory process.
Prescribed bodies are somewhat a little bit more in that they tend to be very focused on, for instance, issues like the Aarhus Convention. They're environmental, they're very focused. Remember, the key, the main plank in all of this is that we talk about is our geographical definition of a maritime area, the character, the conservation, the protection, the species, the habitats, the assessments, the ecosystems, the cultural systems. Gee, I even see spiritual something in there somewhere. But I mean, so you have all this very diverse language, but I'm really honing in on this environmental habitat, conservation, the principles of engagement around that and public consultation in relation to our house, for instance. And that's the area that's the biggest concern I'm receiving inwardly from emails and correspondence from people, is this threat. And the other side, I take on board what you're saying, Mr. Cronin, in relation to, I had an email this morning from Cork, from a public representative saying, you know, what about the impact of all this on the vibrance of maritime leisure? You know, I'm a director of a company, Dunleary Harbour Company, for 10 years, I was. And so I know the challenges around that and the sensitivities that we also have to have vibrant ports and vibrant harbours, and we've also wind energy, etc. But like, I would ask you to take that away, would you, as another thought, just in terms of something more definite and concrete about the prescribed bodies, and particularly the environmental pillars, and not downing other groups, and there's economic considerations and all of that. So I'd just like to take that away. Just back to, in terms of the monitoring, the deputy there talked about monitoring and enforcement. I mean, are you satisfied we're going to have enough powers around the enforcement bit? Because, well, we have all the objectives and we have all the policy. I'm not 100% sure on the enforcement. And you might touch on the follow-on for enforcement, of course. In Head 24, you're dealing with the penalties and forfeiture. You might just touch on that. So, monitoring, the enforcement of it through the powers of enforcement, you know, because that's really important. But no point having legislation if we can't enforce it. And then the issue of the penalties and the forfeiture, which is, that section is dealt in the Head 24.
Certainly, I was going to actually, because I brought the other experts
Yeah,
here with
no,
me.
absolutely. That's your call, yeah.
You know, if I could ask my colleague, Mr. Conal O'Connor, to maybe address the issue on enforcement. If I could ask him to address the issue on enforcement.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Thank you, Deputy. The powers of enforcement on this have actually been modelled on existing powers of enforcement in various similar marine environmental legislations, and we're quite satisfied that they're quite robust. We took legal advice on these as well prior to putting them into the general scheme. So they would, in terms of the powers of the authorised person, they would have the full suite of powers that any authorised person investigating any similar legislation would have to enter premises, to seize documents, to question people, to gather materials, all within, of course, the confines of the Constitution. But so they have been. We actually didn't reinvent the wheel on these. We're working on existing powerful ones.
Can you at some stage make available to the committee other models where you've looked at in relation to this?
Sure, yeah.
That's okay.
Absolutely,
that's
yeah.
great.
Yeah.
And finally, just to wrap up, I'm conscious other people want to come in. The Aarhus Convention and Head 25 deals with the open access data. And that's really important because it's all about this transparency, it's all about this engagement, it's all about this participation and the principles. Are you fully satisfied that this scheme is fully compliant with the Aarhus Convention and all its objectives? Or have you some concerns or is there doubts?
I don't have any doubts. I suppose what I would reiterate is that what we're aiming for here, one of the fundamental pillars of what we're trying to achieve to deliver this protection of the environment is the concept of participation, very high levels of participation. Now, in my opening statement, I made reference to the fact that, you know, we want a model that will be flexible enough to deal with close to shore areas with a lot of interests, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of citizens with views, a lot of businesses, and then those more remote areas where we have a very discrete number of interested bodies, specialists and experts, but we need to have full participation in both the identification of the things to protect, in the development of an approach to protecting them, particularly in the design of the management of the site, so the management recommendations, but also in our engagement with sectors like fisheries. One of the things that's very clear is they have knowledge that we don't get from scientific research. And we get that from local coastal communities as well. And we need to be able to design a system that allows the designation to capture that information so that when we go then to the development of management activities, so whether they be actually management that is, you know, intervenes in some way with human activity, or whether it is, you know, education and guidance, but that we have the people who will need to take it up part of the design process. So that's what we have tried to do. I think you had a question on monitoring as well, if I can try and answer it. Yeah, so in relation to monitoring, we have a national monitoring programme already for the marine environment, okay, that runs on 6-year cycles. And this marine protected area exercise, this work to create these designations, forms part of a wider programme of work to protect the marine environment. And the monitoring programme would fall in under that.
Okay. Okay, that's great. Thanks very much for your
Thank you, Senator.
responses. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Callahan. I'm going to invite Deputy Callahan in next, please.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks very much to the officials for coming in. Very much welcome this legislation. It is hugely important. I agree with Senator Boyne in terms of strongly agree in terms of the 4 weeks period for public consultation. By the time people in the general public may know that the consultation is open and running, and that takes a bit of time, you may find 4 weeks is finished. So it's not it's 4 weeks on paper, but actually it just doesn't give people an opportunity at all, and that will create problems. So I would strongly urge you to extend that to give sufficient time for public engagement. That is very, very important in terms of confidence in the process, transparency, buy-in, and actually the information you can pick up in that process as well. And for these designations to work, public participation is very important. Any designations, protections, and the enforcement around it does rely on input from the public, and I actually want to ask about that. So I have concerns in terms of the heads, in terms of lack of timelines, there's been too much discretion, a lack of detail, lack of obligations in terms of when MPAs are designated, and also a lack of remedies for any habitats that were destroyed or damaged prior to MPA designations. So just my questions are in terms of the timelines is when will the marine protected areas come into existence? Is there any provision, or will there be any provision in the bill to actually give timelines and specifics on that? Head 6 is very non-committal, as said before. That should really be strengthened to something along the lines of a commitment to 30% by 2030, not up to 30% by 2030. And that is in conflict with the commitment in the weaker languages, in conflict with the commitment, not only the EU obligations, but also the commitment in the programme for government. The heads have complete discretion in terms of commencement of provisions. Can that be changed? In terms of detail for a conservation site or a designated site, what this will actually mean, can detail be given in the bill on that? In relation to enforcement, and the points have been made, not only does the Irish Naval Service at the moment not have the resources around this particular type of enforcement, they've actually been incredibly poorly resourced in terms of their existing duties, to the point of being in, certainly for the last number of years, absolute crisis situation in terms of their resources. So it's critically important that they are resourced properly for this. They're not equipped at the moment, for example, to monitor marine noise. So is that going to happen? And will there be a role for the Marine Institute in supporting the enforcement work of the Irish Naval Service? Because obviously the Marine Institute, and that needs to be better resourced as well, but they would be able to assist in terms of the data end of it, and that end of the enforcement. Just in terms of areas that are not mentioned in the bill, there's no references I can see in terms of EU marine legislation and directive, no reference to the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, the Marine Spatial Plan Directive, the Birds Directive. So, should they be? Are they mentioned, and if so, where? Because I didn't spot it. And should they not be mentioned and included, so that you have that architecture that the bill sits within? In terms of monitoring, and others have mentioned this, there is Section 2, Head 4.3. There's no obligation on the Minister to actually appoint anyone to monitor. Should that not be? It simply allows for it to happen, so it should not be changed, so that there is an obligation for someone to be appointed on monitoring. Monitoring is very, very important. It's a key aspect of the Habitats Directive, for example. So if there isn't monitoring, we have a very serious, how does it work without monitoring? And surely not having an obligation to monitor is a weakness in the heads. In terms of cetaceans, we need, an acoustic network around Ireland to protect cetaceans, whales and dolphins. And, will this legislation supports this objective. There's no mention. There is a mention in the opening statement of a MPA network, but there's no mention in the bill about that. And surely having a network of MPAs and where they join an acoustic network as well as part of that is important. Should that not be considered? Carbon-rich habitats are not mentioned in the bill, and these are very, very significant sources of CO2 emission, especially when they're disturbed by activities such as bottom trawling. So should carbon-rich habitats not be recognised in the bill? On the issue of if a licence is granted for marine activities in error and subsequent data emerges that shows that there isn't any provision that I can see in this bill that would allow for such a licence to be revoked. So should there not be, for those situations and those scenarios, should there not be some provision for that? And then just finally, in terms of access to justice, should there not be a mechanism, and in terms of enforcement as well, should there not be a mechanism for the public to express and raise the need for concerns, including around enforcement, similar to Section 160 of the Planning and Development Act? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Gallant.
Apologies, I have another meeting. I have a lot of questions like Cian and others. Hopefully we'll catch up at a later stage, but I just want to apologise after leaving.
We have 2 more sessions on this anyway, yes. And I'm going to allow the officials to answer all of those questions. And I know Deputy Callahan has been in the chamber, but at least we get the answers on the record, and we'll facilitate you at another later.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Deputy Gould. Sorry, Mr. Crone.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Thank you, Chair. Okay, so just if I can pick up on some of the points raised by the Deputy there and maybe give some response to some context. So I think we've noted the issue on the timing, and we'll take that away. I think we know there's a piece of work that needs to be done on that. Okay. In relation to, you raised, I think, a point on reference to EU legislation. So we have covered that in Head 6. We've tried to create that articulation clearly around not only the EU legislation, but the global obligation as well. So the United Nations conventions and it's the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. It's in Section 3.1.2b, I think. And we have it in D as well. So we have reference to those, and we have a national marine strategy for the protection of the environment under that directive already in place. It's been in place since 2008, and we have made reference to that as well. So we're trying to create that link in it. But if we need to make it clearer, we can do that as well.
And sorry to interrupt, but just, Chair, I appreciate that is there in relation to the Ocean Environment Policy Statement, and it says that should take into account as appropriate and gives a comprehensive list. My point is on the legislation itself and the bill itself. Yeah. Apart from those references about taking those into account, there aren't any other links into that architecture within the bill. So there isn't any.
No, but much of what we're trying to do here isn't based on European legislation. So this isn't based on the 2 primary conservation instruments, or the Birds Directive and the Habitats Directive. The Marine Strategy Framework Directive is protection of the environment with sustainable use. But what we're seeking to do here is to create further designations beyond obligations. The obligation in the Marine Strategy Framework Directive is to set up that framework for protection, but it doesn't give you a list. So there's a very specific part of that directive that seeks for you to create this network of marine, or this spatial protection, this marine protected areas, okay? And it's to go beyond what's required in those lists in the Birds and Habitats Directive, and that's what this endeavours to do. Now, we can make reference, we can take it away and think about how we would describe that more clearly. So the anchoring point in the EU acquis, in those laws, how that kind of flows through. We can certainly take that away as well. There's no problem with that.
We're in 2023 now. You have a target.
Sorry, just remind members to mute there, please. Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Crone, go ahead.
It's okay. There was a point I think you raised on enforcement as well. So the role of the Naval Service, we're aware of the constraints the Naval Service has, and I would consider that, you know, we have talked at length with colleagues in the Department of Defence about what to do in this situation, and we don't have another alternative, but it's quite clear that the distinction of the role between, the Naval Service acts as an agent of the state in this instance. Prosecution takes place in a different way. There will, I think, in our view, be other ways of enforcing or ensuring that the conservation objectives are upheld. In other words, ensuring that we improve the environment. So closer to shore, involvement of society in marshalling it so it becomes part of the social value structure is much more important than a police force at sea. Further out at sea, where we have discrete activities, we already have functions, so whether it's fisheries patrol and enforcement or other activities. I think then you raised a point about the role of the Marine Institute as well, that they don't have an enforcement function at all. They do, however, you're right to identify, have a role in terms of scientific information and gathering of data. And we already, the department has a service level agreement with the Marine Institute in place since 2019. And certainly we are looking at reviewing that service level agreement, and we can see what role they may play in future in terms of warehousing of information, gathering of information, providing scientific advice and assessments, the sort of services we get from them already, okay? I think you then had a point on acoustic monitoring. So we already have a monitoring program for human-made noise in the sea, both impulsive noise and lower frequency noise caused by shipping. And we collate that noise monitoring with all the other countries in the Northeast Atlantic. So that is in place already, okay? I think you then mentioned some specific types of things like cetaceans, so mammals, and carbon-rich habitats.
And sorry, just on that, well, I mean, would the Navy be given resources around acoustic monitoring? If they're doing enforcement?
It's not yet clear that you would carry out the acoustic monitoring from naval vessels. So some of our acoustic monitoring is from fixed positions. Okay, so you have a kind of sentinel outpost. Others, it is in relation to an activity is going to take place in a certain location, and the frequency and intensity of the noise energy introduced, so you don't have to monitor because already what sort of impact it's going to have, and that activity is already regulated for so historically for us it was oil and gas exploration. We're now moving into a phase where it's going to be investigations and development of offshore renewables. Okay. You mentioned carbon-rich habitats as well. This is one of the key things we're trying to achieve in this, is to create an identification of things like that to protect. And this is where we think the Ocean Environment Policy Statement gives us the flexibility to list those priority issues. We have in our programme of measures under the Marine Strategy Directive, which we reported to Brussels in December of last year, identified the need to protect those carbon-rich habitats. And just as late as yesterday afternoon, we had a nature-based solutions workshop on coastal carbon habitats across a number of government departments and local authorities and research institutes. Okay, so it's a thing, I suppose, what I'm trying to say to you is we know about it, and it's in our sights to do something about it.
No, which is great, but just given the importance of carbon-rich habitats, should they not be mentioned in the bill? That's really what I'm asking.
I know the concern we have about starting to make a list. And when we did our long piece of work on this, we did have a big, long list of things. But the more we put on the list, the more we find things we didn't put on the list. So what we would rather do now is to make that prioritization list in the policy statement, and then to collect those species, habitats, ecosystem services like carbon storage, ecosystem features, collect them in the identification piece. And that allows us to have more participation. If we, as the officials, were to just make our list of what we wanted to protect, we would be excluding a lot of the participation piece.
And Chair, I appreciate that rationale, but just in terms of climate change, carbon-rich habitats in our oceans are incredibly important. So for us to have a piece of legislation on marine protected areas that doesn't even mention that, to me seems strange. I appreciate that there's, not wanting to have a long list, but this is of incredible strategic importance to us in terms of our climate change strategy. And
I think we can find a way of describing it. I think if it needs to be brought more to the fore, because it is one of the objectives that we have set ourselves, and it's what we got from the experts and the public consultation. So I think we just need to take away your observation and see how we would put it into the description. But I mean, it's certainly something we have given a lot of thought to. Yes. Thanks. Do I have? You had a thing on monitoring, I think, as well.
Yeah, just that the heads allow for monitoring, but there isn't any obligation for monitoring, or the minister can appoint someone to monitor.
Yeah,
I mean, monitoring is incredibly important for this to work.
Yeah. So this, without getting into too much of the complexity around how the designation and the management recommendation would work. In a management plan for a site, you can include monitoring requirements or obligations, so that you can create monitoring obligations for those who are in the site or for the site itself. Okay, and then those monitoring obligations, monitoring is carried out by a number of different competent bodies in the state and by others as well. We have citizen science monitoring as well, but you would then identify who is appropriate to do the monitoring, and then as part of not just the designation but the management recommendations for a site, you would have a piece of monitoring that would take place with it. And of course, for different sites, there's different levels of monitoring. For a scientific research site, it might have a lot of monitoring because it's a very sensitive or fragile. For something that might have a slower recovery time, the monitoring might be less frequent. But it is certainly part of the process of ensuring that you're travelling in the right direction towards a conservation objective.
And I appreciate the answer. It's just the heads, as it's written, is that monitoring can take place. Someone can be appointed, not that they shall be. That's okay. The concern I have. That's quite we can loose.
Take that. Yeah. I mean, we can see how we describe make that more clear.
Yeah, I mean, if we're all agreed that monitoring is absolutely key, then the legislation shouldn't be a discretion. I mean, we have to look at it in. We have to imagine a scenario that you get a minister at some point who just isn't interested in this and is hostile to it, and then we've passed legislation that allows them not to appoint anyone to monitor. And we're trying to protect against that scenario if that was to ever happen.
I think head 19 is the duties of management authorities. We can look at that and see how we would describe it more fully and more clearly, specifically.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Deputy Callahan. And I think we got through all the questions there. Great. So I'm going to take the next slot, and I just want to follow on from something Deputy Callahan said. And I'm conscious, that people will be watching this and have great interest in our marine environment, people along all our coastal communities. Could you describe for me a carbon-rich ecosystem out there, or that Deputy Callahan was describing? What kind of feature, or coral or kelp or something like that, seagrass?
I'm just going to ask Dr. O'Kyla just to spread the burden here. But
I really appreciate the range of expertise we have here and the opportunity to learn from this. So.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pertinent question, actually, given the workshop as well that we had yesterday. At the moment, in terms of carbon-rich or carbon-capturing habitats, there are those that are seen as potential carbon-capturing habitats, and then there are those that are sort of accredited as major carbon-capturing habitats. The two that come to mind immediately would be salt marshes, of which, of course, we have quite a large resource in Ireland. And also seagrass habitats, both of which are very efficient and actually, in comparison with forests, for example, rank very highly globally in terms of their ability to capture carbon. A tropical example would be mangrove forests as well. And then in terms of potential blue carbon habitats, you mentioned kelp and also things like submerged muddy plains or abyssal plains, for example, which aren't disturbed, obviously capture decades and much more, hundreds of years of biological material and carbon-based material that sits on the seafloor at depth for thousands upon thousands of years. So these potential blue carbon habitats are ones that we're also turning attention to, and this is one of the reasons that we had this workshop yesterday in terms of nature-based solutions and how can we work to protect what we have and restore possibly what needs to be restored and look to potential blue carbon habitats. So there's some very interesting research happening in the country at the moment. 'em, by a number of institutions funded by the EPA and the Marine Institute, for example.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you.
Thanks, Deputy Callahan. Deputy O'Kyla.
So the terminology we use then is blue carbon habitats. So it's marine, carbon rich, or with the ability to suck in the carbon, or the carbon is sucked in already. So if we were to equate it to something on land, and a lot of the time when we were doing the marine planning stuff, we had to think, how do we do it on land, and to kind of get our bearings on it. So we equate it to something like our raised bogs or something like that. Those type of habitats out there, a lot of locked in carbon in them that we want to protect. Okay, that's interesting. And is any of that potential carbon, natural carbon capture, or locked in carbon, is that, so we're carrying out a land use strategy for our climate action plan and to allocate the amount of CO2 sequestration there. Are we doing something similar for our marine area as well as part of that? Could we look at, say, the potential of our seagrass habitats out there to incorporate that into it?
Yeah, so under the climate action plan,
yeah.
so in the 2023 climate action plan, we inserted in the 2022 one first, but we've identified just that particular issue. So in the 2023 climate action plan, we have this piece of work, the piece of work Dr. O'Kayla highlighted, was this study, how much is there? What is that potential? A simple question, but one we don't know the answer to, but a very important question to ask and to get an answer to, because if you look at what Deputy O'Callaghan highlighted in his intervention, how much do you protect? Where do you apply that protection? So those questions really need to come to us, or those answers need to come to us, so we can effectively protect these habitats. So you then see where marine protection, biodiversity and climate mitigation all flow into one space. And if you create the right spatial designation under this proposed general scheme, you will have a climate regulating benefit through carbon storage. You'll have a biodiversity benefit. These carbon habitats are biodiverse, are very rich in biodiversity. So you have all of those things will flow into one space. So it has been identified, and we are working on it through the climate action plan as an action.
Okay, and kind of follow-on question to that, can you plant seagrass? Can you expand where seagrass naturally occurs? Can you make conditions right that it expands? You can, yeah. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Yes, it's possible. It's something we're looking at actually through the OSPAR Convention. There's a Northeast Atlantic Environment Strategy that has a number of objectives, and one of them is looking at nature-based solutions and also restoration of carbon-rich habitats, and things like seagrass, for example, can be replanted. There's a project that is being led, there are a number of projects being led in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, and we're interacting and supporting Sweden, actually, as one of the contracting parties to OSPAR, on the best practice methods for seagrass restoration. So it can be done. I think the challenge is a resource challenge. It's also a scientific challenge, but it is being looked at in a number of OSPAR countries, and we're very much engaged with that whole process.
Very good. We'll take the learnings back to here. So just to follow on then as well on that, and we talked about data collection, and from my knowledge, we've been sort of maybe haven't applied as much resources as should have been over the decades to our marine environment, to research and data collection there. But we do have considerable amount of interest from wind energy developers out there who are going to have to carry out environmental assessments or whatever extra type of assessment may be required by an MPA designation being in place, similar to an SAC, where you carry out a more stringent check. Is all of that data that's been gathered out there done in a kind of standardised format and accessible to the Irish state to build up our body of knowledge out there? We have people who are going out and collecting this data. Are we coordinating that?
This stuff we are doing, we're coordinating, is the best I can say to you, without saying that we're not coordinating. So if a private company is doing something and they have commercial confidentiality around the information they're gathering for their own internal decision-making processes, I presume that will still apply to them. From our point of view, we have a coordinated monitoring program to gather all that data to make a set of decisions around the health of the environment that we do every 6 years. So yes, we do. I think when we look at having all the information that is available to make good decisions. So let's take the example of we want to make a designation decision or a decision on management or even monitoring. What we're trying to capture here in this general scheme is a structure where we can get all the information that can be given to the experts, that can be brought forward. So if it's private sector monitoring information or data, if it's research institutes, if it's public bodies who've gathered the information, whether they be local or national bodies. Also, we're very keen to ensure that non-scientific knowledge is also included in that data. So place names, local practices, history, experiences of people who engage with the sea and how they describe that. So all that information, we would like to capture all of that. So there is a large data set as well then available to us through the Marine Institute. But often we need to make sure that the data has a set of quality standards to it. So, you know, there is that other issue around timeline for data, quality standards, before we can then say it's appropriate to use that data.
So just in the overall scheme of things where we have so much environmental assessments going to be carried on out there, you know, is there a standardised form of this data should be gathered in this type of format so that the data is of value to us, that it's all compatible with? You can have several sets of information, but they may not be interrelatable. Is that something we need to set out in kind of offshore renewable standards or planning guidelines for the offshore, or conditions attached to planning? The planning, the consenting of activity isn't our area of speciality in this team. But if I could just speak to the general point, maybe we have a standardised data gathering mechanism across all the European Union member states, and even those countries not in the European Union, for exactly the purpose, which is to ensure that what we're measuring is comparable to each other, so that when we make our assessments, they're the same assessments. So those data standards do exist already. Okay. In Head 25 of the draft general scheme, we've made particular point of having open access data. And again, this is because we've recognised that I think there's an acronym FAIR, which is
findable, accessible, interoperable,
and reusable. So this, I think, speaks exactly to the point you're making, Chair, which is that we would aim to have data collected and used for this purpose that we could then reuse again and again and again. I mean, we in our team have a thing which is, you know, measure once and use many times. That's our objective, because that's the most cost-effective way of doing things, you know.
Okay, very good. And then it was interesting you mentioned the sort of non-scientific, the more sort of qualitative data that would come from a lot of the statutory or non-statutory engagements that a lot of these developers would do as well. So I know, so along through Wexford and Wicklow and Dunleary and Dublin at the moment, a lot of the offshore developers are having public meetings and they're gathering that data and that kind of what people's thoughts are on what they're going to do. So when we were doing the Maritime Area Planning Act, and I don't know the correct term for it, but it was sort of like a marine activities register, or a register which was going to be run by MARA, so anybody seeking MAC consent or licensing or doing anything out there, there would be a register which would be open and accessible. And as I understand, the new planning bill being published today will have something similar, like an environmental portal where all environmental impacts or everything that goes with it. Will there be something similar for marine protected areas, where the sort of initial, you might have a sort of a candidate area and you do the research and you come back and say, well, this does qualify, and all the processes and the public consultation. Is there that type of portal associated with MPAs, the MPA Act? bill?
At the moment, we have, you know, a strong commitment to transparency and participation. We don't set out in the general scheme at the moment that it will all go on a website, but certainly it's something that may be very useful to do. There is a wider project under the planning side, which is this National Marine Atlas, which would show you a lot of, I think, visual representation, a mapping system would show you a lot of this information. You know, in my own thought processes, when I roll into the future, when designations are completed, you know, you can see where they would reside, you know, as a piece of information for activities for decision makers, where you would be able to drill into them and say, what are we protecting here? Yeah. It's not just a shape. What are we protecting? What are the rules around that protection? You know, everything right down to the issues around monitoring, and you know, so you have very high levels, much higher levels maybe of transparency than we might have seen previously. So I think that piece is a good objective and is achievable. How we project the participation piece, at the moment we've made reference to on a government website, just because it's a standard, transparent way of describing it. If we in the future need to get into, you know, a dedicated site so that those who are interested but not participating would say, so those keen observers, where they would be able to see into the process, we can consider that as well, so that you would then potentially have a workshop piece of a website where only those involved could maybe go in. And then you have the front of house where this is the work we're producing. This is our work program. This is the plan. This is where we're going to next. These are the meetings we're having. So it's maximum transparency, you know. These are the people who are involved. This is the list of organizations who've contributed. So those sorts of things are maybe difficult to encode in legislation, but should be maybe at the center of how we describe the how we put the participation piece into effect. So yes, certainly it's something that we would consider.
I think having access to that information is a major part of the battle that sometimes happens when you try to protect something. I think even in land-based planning, I keep going back to land planning, but you know, when you try and put in, say, an architectural conservation area, it tends to be, well, this is going to stop me doing this, this, and this. It tends to be light on, well, this is the reason we're doing it, and this is the benefits that are going to accrue from it. And I do think that type of easy access, like an environmental impact report, where you would have the non-technical kind of summary, where somebody can go and say, okay, that's where it is, that's the reason it's been done, that's really good. Sometimes the stuff is too technical or too obscure, and all the information is out there, but you have to go trawling and looking for it. If we can bring it together, I think that's really part of the battle of bringing the hearts and minds of people along. The science will support why we're doing it, but we also need to bring along the public and those that might see that they may be affected by this, but don't see how they benefit from it, and I think that's quite important. It kind of leads me on to, I think in your opening statement you talked about the public consultation on whether we should do marine protected areas or not. I'm probably paraphrasing it there, but 99% of people, I presume 1% of people just ticked the wrong box. Was that what it was? Tell us about how you consulted and went out there and came to that kind of, that's a resounding sort of level of support for this.
I suppose if I go back to even before we started with the expert advisory body, so we as the expert team in government have been acutely aware of the need to do this for a long time. But of course, you know, we operate within a system and we must make sure that we do what the system requires of us. But it's really clear, and I think just to pick up on your last point, Chair, it's really clear that we have the science. The scientific facts are irrefutable. You know, the scientists are really clear, not only nationally but internationally, that there is a crisis and we must take action. So, but again, the difficulty has been in our actions historically that we've forgotten to bring the people with us. So in the establishment of the advisory body, we were quite conscious of not just capturing life scientist views, but also social scientists, so the people part of it. You know, what makes something valuable to people, okay? And then the governance and legal experts, how would we do this? What would be the rules around it? So those sort of experts. And even in their work, which took place during the first COVID lockdown in 2020, that group and us as the support were really conscious of a need to get the non-science voices, so non-expert voices. So we held in September 2020 a number of really good roundtable discussions online where we picked someone from the fishing sector, someone from wind, someone from tourism, local representatives, local communities, and we environmental groups, and we sat them in virtual round tables with an independent moderator. And, you know, we gave them a short presentation and what do you like, what don't you like, what are you worried about? And that was the seed that planted in our minds, and that feedback is in the expert report as well, what they said. That planted in our minds that we thought they would resist the idea of MPAs, but no, everybody was in favour at that point, before we went to public consultation. But what they all said was, we want to know and we want to be involved. That's it. Just tell us. So we don't want to, and the point you raised, we don't want to find out after the event, where we have to manage the change, where we have to manage the disruption, where we're angry and confused about why you're doing it. So we suddenly realized our challenge was the participation piece. Not, you know, the science will support if we can get participation right. We then launched, once that report was published in February 21, we launched, February 21, yes, we launched a public consultation. And it was online. It was semi-structured, so we had a set of questions, but we also had open text. And we would run consultations for a lot of other environmental issues around the sea, and you might get 50 or 60 keen respondents. We got over 2,300 individual responses, so it was overwhelming, the response. So the number was really big. It covered everybody. So we had not just those really aware of it in urban areas, but we had all the rural communities, all the sectors involved in the sea, all age groups as well. Okay, so we were really impressed by the response. And as part of that, before we analysed the responses in the summer of 21, we went around the coastline and we sat outside, we stood at social distancing, we sat in circles outside in car parks, and we gave our show and tell, and we had Minister of State Noonan with us at the time, and we gave our show and tell, and we just had a Chatham House rules: what do you like, what don't you like, what are you worried about? And it was the same response we got before, which was, we have no problem. The fishermen, for example, were the one community who said, we're the only group who need a healthy marine environment to carry out our activity. But we need to be involved because we have invested in our sector personally. So if there's change coming, we need to be involved in the country, when the change will happen, how we will participate in that process. So again, this was reinforcing the message we got from the first piece on the expert group. And then the public consultation analysis said the exact same thing. We then moved to the drafting of this. We could write down the minister shall designate. That piece of the build out from that is where the challenge arises, because consultation is easy. You press pause, you go out and you just ask a simple question. Participation, as we see it, and from what we heard from the public and from society and from the sectors, participation had two pieces. They want to be involved in the identification of what's important to protect, because it may not always be the thing we prioritise. So in a coastal community, their local environment may be much more important than the specific species or habitat. The second thing then was, how do you get meaningful engagement in the design of a site? So this is, in this general scheme, we've tried to create these, what we call ad hoc groups, that would work in a kind of informal way at helping deliver the work for the expert group. So you could bring in everybody who had an interest in a particular location or a particular species or habitat, who had information or a view on what should happen, and you can then create some sort of consensus on collaboration. So that's what we've tried to design, but it comes from what we know will work. We've also then looked at best international practice, and many protected sites around the world have been accused by outside bodies, by the environmental pillar, as being paper parks. They exist as a shape on a map and nothing else. So we've tried in this to create the design of the management recommendations with the designation. So try to connect the two of them. It may not always be possible, they may have to be done one after the other, but the objective would be to do the two of them at the same time, so that there's certainty around the site is there and this is what it will mean. So if you again think about some of the interventions from the committee members around, offshore renewables, for example, are an operative sector. Certainty is the big thing that everybody needs to have, okay, around what will it mean for me. So we've tried to incorporate that. And what we noticed about our approach, what the public told us, was when we saw what the Convention on Biological Diversity is doing in the kind of post-2020 piece, it is saying this is about all of society doing this together for the benefit of society and nature. So we think we've captured it in an Irish context for the marine environment. That's the objective of what we're trying to achieve. That's the aim. But it comes from what the public have said they want. They have concerns, of course. It affects different groups in different ways. For some, it's their livelihood, For others, it's how they feel about things. But we need to make sure that as we go forward, they're all included. And that's what we're trying to capture.
Okay, and I imagine most of the concerns, and it's kind of natural to think when you look out to sea, to most people it's just the sea, it's just a flat surface going on out to the horizon. It's those coastal features that they've become much more aware of and want to protect, the dunes or the headlands and the migratory bird sites, that kind of thing. In terms of trying to inform the public and keep the public generally informed of, there's a marine protected area out there, it's 12 kilometres out to sea. Say on a lot of our viewing points and our headlands around the country, I really think information boards, that's out there, it's that size. It coexists with the fishing community, with the offshore. That's what we're trying to protect. I really think that would be a very helpful part of the process. It's a little bit down the line. Let's designate and get our management plans out there first. But did that come up?
Oh, yes, certainly. We have had a lot of feedback in relation to being made aware. So this is what we would call education or citizen engagement, so the terms we would use, but how we would inform the public about what we're doing. So both on the ground, so on site, okay, but also then, as we go through a process. So at the moment, we have a number of citizen engagement initiatives that we do for things like marine litter, where we give ownership more or less of your local area, stewarded by a local community. And we fund that as part of our programme of work. So we see that there's a similar approach could be adopted here. We see a good template for engagement. I think Dr. O'Kayla mentioned this issue on nature-based solutions. Again, if you've got local communities who are aware of the value of the environment and you provide the resources to them to steward it, so there will be a need for resources. Yeah. You do get their support, because it goes from them being, the system recognises their involvement in the seascape, but I think there's still huge opportunity for things like very simple things like signboards and notice boards. It's certainly something you would notice in other member states, that it's much more prevalent. We have, and it's just for information, and it is not certain yet, but we have, we are finalising an application for EU funding to deliver a lot of the marine protected area work. We're hopeful that we will get it, but again, we don't control the decision-making process. But part of the description of the work we want to do in the delivery of marine protected areas is a huge module on communications. So explaining, talking, engaging, not talking at, talking with, and delivering it on a regionalised basis. So not from the centre out, but being out where the people involved in the sea are.
I think it's critical to the success of these, and in all things. And we as a committee, we looked at the river basin management plans and water quality in general in the country, and I often ask myself, why are more people not banging on my door, worried about these things? And it's stuff we take for granted, and the sea is particular. Everything that washes off the land and out the sinks, and it's the ultimate depository for everything coming off the land, and the other functions it provides for us as well. it was mentioned that some EU directives were not mentioned specifically, I think, in it. I actually thought there was a very wide range of different conventions and directives and requirements mentioned in it. But just to be clear, if an EU directive is not mentioned in something, we still have an obligation to comply with that EU directive.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Just to clarify that. And then finally, it's around, and you mentioned it, the designation and the management plans to kind of go similarly or in tandem with each other. It's something we would have learned from designating Natura sites that we didn't apply management plans. So essentially, we just had that line on the map. Another issue is, fragmentation and connectivity. So is that something that needs to be considered in marine protected areas, the movement of species through it, the ecological corridors in the marine environment? Is that part of management plans as well?
There are two separate issues. So in relation to management plans for the sites, I think in my opening statement I made a point about the fact that human activity can take place in marine protected sites where it's compatible with the conservation objectives. Now, for that activity to take place, there must be some sort of management plan around the site so that, when you go into the site, you can say, well, I'm complying with the management plan. I know that my activity, I can row my canoe or paddle my canoe across the top of a site that protects eelgrass or seagrass meadows because I'm not damaging them in any way. So I think that that piece is something that will be, I think, essential for them to be effective. Okay. Now, in relation to then a broader network or connectivity, I think is the term you used, Chair. The term connectivity means different things for different species and features. So to give you two examples, if you're a mussel bed or an oyster bed, connectivity is touching, or it's very close to touching, because it's about how the sites communicate with each other for the species. If you're a large mammal, a large migratory whale, maybe moving from the Azores to Icelandic and Arctic waters, connected sites might be hundreds of kilometers apart, and they're linked to your life cycle stages. So calving, feeding, and different following the food stocks. So it would be possible, and it would be one of our objectives, to create a connected network with the qualifier that connectivity means different things. Certainly, we see the opportunity to collaborate with other countries in the Atlantic to create a broader network. Now, this network of Irish sites will sit inside a North Atlantic network that's already in development. There's 1.5 million square kilometres of the North Atlantic that's already protected. And this work that we're doing will fit inside that. And it would ensure then that where we place sites will be connected and representative of all the things, and also talk to other member states and other countries' sites, whether they're in the EU or outside the EU. Okay, so I think that piece will be possible and would be a useful objective, and would give you an example of the sort of priority you could put into the ocean environment policy statement, where you could highlight the fact that these large mammals and their life cycle stages would need to be protected on a transboundary basis. The other point I think you mentioned was in relation to the movement of certain species, that they might change their location either from climate change, or so water is getting warmer, so cold water species are moving further north, and then species that we've never had before in our water are appearing more frequently in our water. We have thought about the idea of having a marine protected area that has a shape that changes from time to time. We think that might be legally difficult to describe and even more difficult to enforce. What I think we've settled on is the idea that we would be able to review the site designations, so that if the thing we're protecting, if the science has told us that it has moved to another location, we could consider the designation of the protection where that species now is scientifically proven to be. So that would allow us to have the protection follow the thing we're trying to protect. So if it's moving more northerly, for example. So we've seen evidence of commercial fish stocks are starting to appear in more northerly locations. So we think that there's probably going to be other non-commercial species, and that will also move north to follow the colder water. So yes, I think we can do that.
Thanks, Mr. Cronin. Look, I can see from what you're telling us and your colleagues and what I've read here, there's been like a huge amount of work has gone into that, and all angles considered. And thank you for that work. Deputy Breen, you just come back in.
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, and again, apologies for having to leave. We just have a clash with Minister O'Brien in the chamber, which is unfortunate. But I'm going to go back over some of my questions. If you've dealt with them in my absence, please don't repeat yourselves. Just let me know, and I'll go and read them in the transcript, because I don't want to be wasting your time. One follow-up question just on the expert body. At this stage, has the department decided what the process for appointment will be? Will it be direct appointment by the Minister? Will it be the Public Appointment Service? Or will there be some other mechanism to appoint? And do you envisage the legislation being quite explicit in terms of the kinds of expertise that would be required so that it's fully constituted in that respect? The question with respect to designation, and this probably has been answered, but just the timeline for designation. So assuming the legislation is passed within an appropriate time here and commenced, when do you hope to start making designations, and what's the kind of notional timeline for that? I do want to go back to Head 14.5a, because Richard, and I don't remember the exact phrase you used, but you did talk about how we were fortunate that we have a very, very large marine area and there was kind of enough space for everybody. However, clearly Head 14.5a is for those set of circumstances where there is a conflict, where some kind of activity that has been previously granted may not comply with conservation objectives. My question there is, like, how will that decision be made to allow a activity that doesn't comply to continue? Will that be open to review? Will it be open to third-party intervention, etc.? Again, enforcement, and I'm sure the colleagues have raised it, because key in all of these things isn't just having a really good system for designation, which we all want, and meeting the 30% as quickly as possible, but it's also ensuring there's proper enforcement, because we do have some designations currently, as you mentioned, and there would be a view out there in many communities and organisations that our enforcement of the existing designations in certain locations can be very poor. So again, that question I asked about, first of all, the environmental capacity of the Naval Service, and whether or not some kind of cooperation, particularly between the Marine Institute and the Navy in terms of enforcement, is required. Monitoring, again, if you've dealt with it, please refer me to the transcript, but I'm particularly interested in what is going to be monitored. Is it the network? Is it the network every 6 years? What about the requirement, for example, to monitor the marine protected areas themselves individually every 7 years as is required? Who will do that? How will it be resourced? And then I suppose two supplementary questions. If you dealt with restoration, I would maybe ask you to just summarise what you've said already, because it's a very important issue, particularly in those areas that have been previously designated but not necessarily properly maintained. But a lot of this does come down to the science of the data, and we all know that our database is pretty weak, and that's no criticism of anybody from the department, just in terms of the full extent of what it is that we're trying to designate and protect. So, will there be additional resources, do you understand, that are going to go into the constant need to improve and expand the scientific knowledge and database for the designations, and as you mentioned, the potential shifting of those designations? And then the last thing is obviously we're going to listen to other bodies, and some of those bodies are very well resourced and very professionalised. Others, and particularly inshore fishermen, who have had a pretty hard time of it over the last number of decades, they have always told us when we talk to them they struggle to engage with some of these processes because they're very, very technical and complex, and they're busy out catching fish and keeping their families fed and roofs over their heads. How are we going to ensure that some of those interests that are vital in terms of the public participation, and I think actually in many ways have an alignment with the need to protect marine biodiversity, because if it's done right, there's a mutual benefit both for our ecosystems and for coastal communities and their economic livelihoods. How do we make sure that some of those constituent parts are really, really involved and they're brought to the centre of the process? Because we even know ourselves sometimes engaging with some of those groups through no fault of their own is a challenge because of their capacity. And I'm particularly interested to hear about your engagements with the smaller inshore fisher communities who could be very negatively impacted by a lot of the changes that we may see in the marine over the future years, and that would be something I think most of us in the committee would like to avoid.
Thank you, Deputy. If I could maybe ask my colleague, Dr. O'Higgins, to address the issue of the development of the expert body, because we had a lot more text and we took it out because like with regulation, and I will then address some of your other issues, and I'll tell you where I have provided information already. Okay, Dr. O'Higgins.
So, yeah, we've given quite a lot of thought to try the constitution of the expert body. There's the processes and procedures that we've kind of considered are probably too complicated to include in the primary legislation, so we think that it'll be done by ministerial order, and we work out the exact machinations of that kind of at a later date, but we have considerable thinking on it.
Thank you. And then just a number of issues. So the 14.5a, I didn't address that previously, and it is something, the qualification threshold for the invocation of that sort of clause needs to be further worked on. I think that's...
And would it be your hope that the qualification threshold would be set out in legislation, or there would be elements of it set out in legislation?
Yeah.
And do you envisage it would be a process whereby third parties might have an opportunity to input in that without making it overly cumbersome or time consuming?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can commit to going into that level of detail, okay. But this overriding public interest clause is a standard clause that's in the Habitats Directive as well. But again, its inclusion and its use, I think, may be separate issues, but I think we've recognised in our read-through of this that needs further qualification in some way. So, and you know, the objective here through things like the development of a policy statement is to avoid those spatial conflicts as much as possible. There was one question that I'd hoped to catch before you left. It was in relation to restoration.
Yes.
Okay. So restoration as an activity or conservation objective is completely acceptable. So it can be done. That's the short answer. So if you have identified that a habitat is in this condition, a low condition, and you want to move it to a better condition, then restoration is the way. So the only question that exists is whether it's a natural restoration process or whether it's an active restoration process. So in some of the exchanges we've had this morning, we talked about the planting of eelgrass meadows. So that's active restoration, intervention. Passive restoration might be just the removal of a pressure and then allowing something to recover, but certainly restoration can be included. But it would be included as one of the outcomes from the, you know, what's the state of the habitat at the moment, or the state of the species, and where do you want it to be? What's your objective?
And can I just add, with respect to that, one of the things we've learned from terrestrial planning, and particularly from our long considerations of issues around substitute consent, is that while many things are possible, unless legislation sets them out and in certain circumstances mandates either exploration or potential recommendation of them, they're less likely to happen. So while we may finally have a substitute consent regime for the land that doesn't fall foul of domestic and European law, we'll have to wait and see if that's the case. The issue around where substitute consents are granted and in the period where the activity was taking place, there was significant damage to whether it's the environment or other activities. In fact, restoration very rarely features. So I suppose my question isn't, is it possible? Because clearly it's possible. Yeah. Will the legislation set out in any detail at all or even mention the issue of restoration? And I'm raising that specifically with respect to either A, existing designations that haven't been adhered to because of poor enforcement, B, areas where maritime area consents have been issued where we want offshore wind, but in between the granting of the MAC and the tests and the planning applications and the designation, notwithstanding the interim work you described earlier, things may have gone wrong, even if that wasn't the intention. So will the legislation set out any provisions with respect to restoration? And also, it's all very well talking about restoration, but who funds it? How is it funded? And again, I would have thought some legislative elements of that could be helpful, particularly, for example, if it's somebody with a license or a consent who has done something wrong and should be funding restoration. Is there a legal power to compel them to do so within reason and with appropriate safeguards?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Deputy. So we can certainly make, I think, provision or reference to this, need to restore if necessary, but there's just two pieces of information that I would give the committee. The first is under the polluter pays principle and under the Environmental Liabilities Directive, if there is damage, then it falls to the person who damages or pollutes to bear the cost. These are public goods, and if we have people making private profit from them, they have an obligation to society in general. So the second point then is that all activity must comply with the environmental targets set out in the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which is to achieve good environmental status everywhere, all the time. There may be some discussion about lowering those standards for emergency designations for offshore wind under European regulation, but nevertheless, the general rule is that we have good quality, so we don't, damage is not acceptable. It's sustainable use, and sustainable just means that we can restore it.
I accept all of that, but could I make one other analogy? Because again, we have so much experience of both terrestrial planning and terrestrial building control that there are bad practices in our recent past that we need to learn from. So for example, people who build buildings on land have a legal obligation to build in compliance with the standards, right? Government announced 2 weeks ago a €2.5 billion bill for the taxpayer because of non-compliance. So even though there were clear standards and clear legal obligations, the absence of adequate enforcement, particularly enforcement to ensure that non-compliance is then rectified by those responsible, one would have thought that there was an opportunity in this legislation to ensure strong mechanisms so that if somebody does fail to comply, that not only is there a legal obligation, but there is a mechanism to ensure they rectify and restore. That's really, I suppose, what I'm asking.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I think we can take that into account because I was about to go on a big description of the enforcement, but I see where you're coming from now. And I think we can look at that piece in the...
Because, and I don't want to... I do want to labour the point as somebody who just has been so involved in building defects, and we now have a €5 billion bill for building defects, both in terms of defective block and in terms of houses, apartments and duplexes. And we actually have very good standards when it comes to building control over the years. And there is a legal obligation on people to comply. And there is a mechanism. If they don't comply, I can take somebody to court. But it is such a long, cumbersome, expensive process, it virtually never happens. So again, I just think there are some opportunities for us here because we want this legislation to be the strongest possible legislation and the most robust. So I suppose I want to emphasise that, not for further comment, but I think that's something we'll be looking carefully at in the legislation itself. Sorry for cutting across you, Richard.
No, thank you, Deputy. Thank you. There's a few other points you had made there. One was the timeline for designations. So I'd love to have them all designated. I think we, as a team, would love to have them all designated quite a while ago. And we're conscious of the priorities of other sectors for their rollout of activities in the sea. And also we're conscious of the 2030 deadline and the missed 2020 deadline. So as soon as possible is the safest answer I can give you. But I think if I could get more specific, I think in the objective of the policy statement was that we create a greater level of certainty around those most important things to do immediately. So where do we think energy site, renewable energy is likely to go? Okay, let's go through our process there as fast as timely as possible so that we bring certainty there, okay? Where do we think that we need to fulfill the programme for government for things like a marine national park or large mammals that aren't fully protected, or I think I made reference to 1 or 2 rare species or habitats that are threatened. So make that list. I would be reluctant to call it prioritisation because then you have deprioritisation, but where you would bring greater certainty to the timeline of delivery for those. So you can say then with confidence, we will hit 30%, we will fulfil our obligation, it will be meaningful, we will bring certainty to the sectors who are really looking for that certainty so they can make better decisions and invest. So I think that is what we'll be looking at. We've tried, and we mentioned timelines earlier on, we've tried in the use of timelines here to bring greater certainty to that, but we know in our read-through of this, once it came through approval from government, we need to do a lot more work on tidying up those timelines to create that level of clarity. Okay.
And just on that, Chair, if I could, I don't think you'd find any objection from most of us in committee with the idea of priorities, because you can't do it all at the same time, right? And I think particularly in terms of areas where there are maritime area consents or other potential significant economic activities in the marine, there are two values of clear priorities. One, it avoids accidental or intentional additional marine biodiversity degradation as a result of infrastructural developments. But it also provides greater clarity for applicants, for example, for offshore wind. I mean, one of the things I think many of us made the point when we were dealing with the planning legislation for the marine is actually folks who want to deliver, whether public or private sector interest, who want to deliver large volumes of offshore wind will also benefit from the certainty that the marine protected areas will provide, subject to them being done right. And the likelihood of legal challenge and delay will be reduced. The greater level of certainty about who can do what, where, and under what conditions. So actually, I think if and I can't speak for other committee members, but I'll speak for my own party, if you were saying to us that actually there are prioritisations, and for example, those legacy wind farm projects on the East Coast should be prioritised for all the right reasons, and a number of other ones, I mean, I think that would be a sensible approach.
If I could just, I'm not sure were you in the room when I provided the information that we commenced in December this sensitivity analysis using the experts from the original advisory report. Professor Crowe and a team of other experts. Yeah. So we've already recognised that piece on the Irish Sea for those legacy sites, as you said, and I think that we will see public consultation launching for further sites as well. And we have seen those potential locations, and now our thought processes are about how would we bring more certainty to those, so that we would de-risk those choices and bring that layer of environmental information, that ecological information to the decision-making process. So it is something that even without the legislation having gone through the process of enactment, we know it's a piece of work that has to be done anyway. Okay, I think Deputy, there were you had a piece on enforcement and capacity of the naval service. I answered a question from Deputy O'Callaghan on that. But if in the transcript you feel it's not enough.
Did you include the issue around the involvement of the Marine Institute or bodies with environmental expertise?
Yes.
I'll check the transcript.
Yeah, we did, yeah. I just was clear that the Marine Institute has no enforcement power, but it does have other data gathering and information collation powers, which we would we already have an arrangement with the Marine Institute where we work quite closely with them in the delivery of our services and other services across government. But if you want to check the transcript on that. Then I think there was an issue on data, databases and resources. Yeah, so we have identified a need for resources to, once you establish a site, you have to have some periodic monitoring which has money involved and people involved. We have identified on our side a need for more resources in our team to deliver this. We have, we're developing a workforce plan to expand the size of this team to do that. We are reviewing our service level agreement with the Marine Institute. We are going to apply for life funding to support that expansion on delivery as well. So we're doing as much as we can on resources. The data issue, we have in Head 25 introduced this idea of fair data, which is findable, what does ours say? Accessible, at some point I'll get it right, interoperable and reusable. Yeah. Right? So we have recognised this need to get as much get the information out there. So this transparency around reuse of the information that we gather for this process. Okay, so we have recognised that. There are other data initiatives ongoing as well, and I've made reference as well to the use of non-scientific information in the development of decisions around designation, traditional knowledge, the experiences of local communities. I think that this will be very important, particularly in terms of the legitimacy of the choices that are made. Okay, you had, I think, then a last point, Deputy, in relation to engagement of fishers, and you mentioned particularly inland fishers. Before you just returned to the room, I did describe the process on consultation up until the publication of the public consultation report, so the design of the expert report, and we have spoken directly with all fisheries groups. Now we've identified them based on their representative bodies, okay, and we have engaged with them and sought nominations for them to engage based on the representative from their body. We have a very neutral approach to this. We don't have a view on any of the sectors.
Sure.
It's just to shepherd the whole process forward. And in the participation, the design of participation, we have to design it so that it works for them. So I don't have a direct answer for you now about how it will work for them, particularly around their resource issue. But for us, we need to think about how we design engagement with them so that they can participate in a way that suits them, at a time that suits them, in a style that will work for them. So we have identified in the design of this EU funding bid that we've sought to submit later this year, that engagement piece, so that kind of who do we get to go and deal with them.
Could I make an observation on that? Because obviously the requirement isn't consultation, it's meaningful consultation, and that's a different kettle of fish. And many of us are in large organisations with the capacity to have researchers go off and help us be informed when we come into forums like this. Large industry bodies, whether they're fisheries industries or offshore wind, have those capacities. Large environmental, non-governmental organisations have that. But very often communities or small economic interests like inshore fishermen, inshore fisher people, don't have that capacity. So while I absolutely accept you are and you should be neutral with respect to the sectors, I don't think you should be neutral in terms of ensuring that the consultation engagement is meaningful. And if there are certain sectors, whether they be coastal communities, and I'm very far away, unfortunately, from Dublin Bay, so I don't represent one, but Stephen does, that communities are able to meaningfully engage, and likewise with inshore fishermen, because when, for example, we were doing the National Marine Planning Framework, one of the things those two groups of people were telling us, well, yes, there was lots of meetings. In many instances, they felt when they went to meetings, the language of documentation, the nature of the consultation, the very technical expert level that's required, effectively excludes them. So they are consulted, but not in any meaningful way. So I do think some thought needs to be put in that. And the reason I say that is my long experience of planning is the greater the level of public participation and sectoral participation at the earliest possible stage removes all sorts of concerns and problems as you go down the line. And it avoids that more adversarial nature that we find in terrestrial planning, where people are only getting engaged at the point in which there's an application to the board or tomorrow or whatever. So just that as an observation. I did have one other question there, just in terms of the monitoring and the network versus the marine protected areas and the timelines, etc. for that.
Okay, if I could just close on one piece on the participation. So I think that we're aiming to go beyond meaningful consultation, and our objective is full participation. So in terms of there's a participation ladder for these things, and a sign in the post office window is the lowest rung on the ladder. You're just going to ignore what's said. And then ownership of the actual process at the very top. We'd like to travel quite a way up that. That's our objective. That's what we really believe is the right way to do it. And we're aware of those different capacities, both in terms of the organisational size and how they engage. And in all the work we've done, we've been very mindful of doing that. So we know, we're all experts on this side of the table, but we're conscious that the people we're engaging with are not. And that's the only way we'll be successful, is mindful that we're doing this in a collaborative way. This is really a reflection of the fact that unless this is designed for everybody, by everybody, it will remain a scientific exercise that will not improve the health of the environment and won't change people's attitudes towards it. So I think we are on the same position going forward with that. We have also engaged with other government departments, like Department of Gaeltacht, World Affairs, on how best to do that. And there are public participation networks that we think will be useful templates for tapping into. Okay. And the second question then was in relation to monitoring.
Monitoring post-designation and monitoring of the network, monitoring of the individual marine protected areas, who's doing it, how's it been done, and what's the level of resourcing of that?
So we already have a national marine monitoring plan that has been running since 2013. And this is under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. And the monitoring for marine protected areas will fall under that as one of the sub-monitoring programs. So this monitoring program does everything from litter, noise, pollutants, the intensity of fishing activities, the state of biodiversity, and these site designations and the status of the sites, the health of them, will fall under that. that monitoring programme is funded through our vote and through the votes of other government departments and agencies who have specific responsibilities, and through EU funding for things like the data collection framework for the common fisheries policy. So that monitoring framework is already there, and if we need to increase the amount of monitoring for these sites, then we will have to provide that in that wider monitoring plan that we have under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. It's specifically referred to as Article 11, but it's just the piece that creates the obligation. We think it's important to include it under that because it creates a wider framework of all the monitoring we do and puts this in a context, because if there's a problem with the status of a site, the other monitoring around the pollutants and human activities will help us to identify what's causing the problem within the site. Okay, so we have that other wider monitoring network. So that will be resourced as well. Okay, and the second part of the question was about.
So again, what is it that is being monitored? Is it the network? Is it individual marine protected areas? Is it portions of those? How is that envisaged?
Okay. So I think that when you look at the network of marine protected areas, you will have to. Each site is monitored for its own status, okay, and then the monitoring of a wider network is about what the network does as the sites interact with each other. So I think as you were coming into the room, I was describing to the chair about how a network of sites for large mammals, large whales, might be hundreds of kilometres between sites. The network might be a pan-Atlantic network. But a network of, say, sites for something that's, fixed to the seafloor, like oyster beds or mussel beds or cold water corals, those are much more discrete. So the network and how its components are related to each other will have to be developed through part of the scientific research or scientific advice of the expert body. And if we have questions like that we don't have full answers to now, this we feel is the ideal advice that you can get from an expert body. The expert body would have both the authority but also the capacity to get the best information on how to do that. There are, I suppose it's worth saying to the committee here today, there is still not full scientific consensus at an Atlantic level around how connected or coherent the wider Atlantic network is. So what's said at the moment is, from a coverage point of view, it's there, but we still can't say scientifically. So I think that we can monitor them, we can interconnect them, we can communicate outside the Irish network to the Atlantic network, okay, because we have species that travel to Scotland and Portugal and the Faroe and the Azores. But I think that if we don't have an answer, we will have to work on developing an approach.
And then just one final supplementary on that. Again, when we were dealing with the National Marine Planning Framework, if I remember it right, one of the debates we were having was whether the overall policy approach of the framework and then all of the bits that fit into it, including the marine protected areas, was adopting a full ecosystems approach and a kind of a whole site approach versus just kind of identifying individual species or individual components of the ecosystem and protecting those. From what you're saying, it is that full ecosystems whole site approach, and therefore it goes beyond just the legal requirements to protect certain individual species or certain individual habitats. It's the interrelationship of the whole ecosystem. And my supplementary question is, because I'm quite reassured by your answers to a number of the questions, but I also live in the real world, and I know you guys have other sections in your own department and there's other sections in other government departments with potentially competing and conflicting priorities. If your answer to my question in relation to the whole site approach and ecosystems approach is yes, to what extent is that going to be the approach right across the different sections of departments in government?
I'm just going to ask Dr. O'Higgins here to maybe respond in relation to the ecosystem-based approach. Thanks.
So the ecosystem-based approach is supposed to be one which integrates the connections between land, air, water, all living things, human beings, and our institutions. Ecosystem approach is common to both the Marine Spatial Planning Directive and the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. It's an underlying common principle between marine spatial planning and environmental protection. So our approach will certainly fit the ecosystem-based approach, and it will speak also to the planning. So the intention is to have this unified approach. I mean, it's quite an ambitious topic, but it's certainly our intention.
Deputy Bryn, can I go back to enforcement for a moment just to clarify something? And Deputy Bryn, you might wish to come back in on this as well, because it was the point you raised. So, MARA have responsibility, the Maritime Area Regulatory Authority will have responsibility for enforcement in consented or permitted areas where there's development going on. So, where a marine protected area is within one of these development zones, will MARA have the enforcement of the management, the objectives of the marine protected area as part of their responsibilities? And for areas where MARA are not involved, where we just have a designated MPA with no consented or permitted activities or licensed activities going on, who's responsible for the enforcement on that? Just to clarify between those two different types of sites.
I'd ask Dr. Higgins to answer that, but this is something we've talked about quite a lot in the team here, but Dr. Higgins.
Yeah.
Thanks, Deputy. There are several management authorities that manage different activities within the marine environment at the moment. So you have agriculture sites, you have offshore renewable energy development, you have dumping at sea. So they're already different management authorities. The way this legislation will work is that it will identify first recommendations, and then it'll identify measures that need to be taken by activities or sectors in the environment to meet the conservation objectives of a particular site. So the management authorities for the activity will be responsible for ensuring that those measures are met. So that's the way it'll work.
Sorry, just for my benefit, could you list off some of those agencies? So MARA will be one.
So
a local authority might be another.
So you have
modify your question, just because I think it would be really helpful for us and also really helpful for people out there. This obviously sits in a wider architecture, right? I think it would be really useful, either A, if you could briefly describe the bits of that architecture, because we have management authorities, we have enforcement authorities, we have monitoring obligations, we have yourselves, we have MARA, we have the board, we have the local authorities. It would be really nice to kind of try and situate what's in this general scheme within the overall architecture. You might need a PhD to be able to tell us that, but...
yeah, it is very complicated, and there are a lot of moving parts, and I do have a PhD.
I don't even have a PhD. I mean, I have a PhD in that issue on its own. It's big and complicated.
It's something that I've looked at quite carefully. So you have the Environmental Protection Agency, who are responsible for Water Framework Directive, which applies to coastal waters, and they're responsible for dumping at sea. You have the Sea Fisheries Protection Authority, who have competence for managing fishing, Irish fishing. You have things like the Inland Fisheries Ireland, which manages coastal fisheries. You have ourselves, who are responsible for the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. You have other colleagues in the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, who are responsible for marine spatial planning. You've got terrestrial planning, you've got MARA. So there's a lot of moving parts, and they haven't, it's a dynamic situation. Everything hasn't quite settled yet. So in designing this piece of legislation, we've tried to ensure that all those parts fit together and make it broad enough so that as things change, they'll still gel.
Apologies, Chair, but
No, go ahead. It's the kind of direction I want to go.
It's good to understand. So, for example, if I'm standing on the coast somewhere and there's a marine protected area and I think something is in breach of the designation, who do I call?
You call, well, it depends. I suppose it depends on what sector that you see. If you see a boat fishing or dog fouling on the beach, it depends on the nature of the activity and the infringement.
Mr. O'Connor,
Could I just ask Mr. O'Connor?
Mr. O'Connor, please.
Yeah, there's a few things. First of all, there's going to be specific management authorities assigned to specific marine protected areas according to what's happening.
Who are they likely to be?
Well, for example, if it's out to sea, it might be somebody like the Navy. If it's closer in, it could be somebody like It could be NPWS, it could be a local authority, it could be somebody like that. But also, there's I think you were talking about what happens if there's a certain activity which breaches the conservation objectives of it. If an authority is licensing an activity or permitting an activity within a marine protected area, they are going to have to, under the legislation, be cognizant of the conservation objectives of that. So that will have to be accommodated within the permitting or the licensing or what have you of the activity within that area. So that organisation who are responsible for ensuring that their licenses or permits are met are going to have to be responsible for that as well. But if there's also, there will be times when there will be regulations. There's a range of management authorities that have been set out in the potential management authorities that have been set out in 15, is it?
Yeah, I think it's 15.
Yeah, had 15, and the appropriate one would be set for each one. So if an activity has been regulated by the minister that it shouldn't be done, and this is separate to a permitted activity by somebody else, it would be that management authority who would then be responsible, or the authorised persons that they might contact, who would be responsible then for the enforcement of that.
Chair, with your discretion.
You're going to ask about a non-regulated activity or somebody else?
So, and again, maybe let's learn some lessons from terrestrial planning, right? So, a local authority grants a permission of planning, and there's an obligation on the person who gets that grant to build according to the plan. Local authority provides a license for quarrying, for example. There's an obligation on the person to quarry in accordance with the license. The first issue is, will the legislation explicitly mandate the managing authority to then follow up and ensure compliance? Because, for example, with our planning system, that's not what currently happens. What happens is, well, if I give you a planning permission as set up in County Council, you have to comply. There is no legal requirement on me to come out and check. It's only if a third-party formal planning complaint is made to the planning authority that somebody goes out to inspect. And that's a difficult enough process, and there's only one person I pick up the phone to. If I'm a regular member of the public, or if I'm somebody who doesn't know the complexity of the system you've just described, and I firmly believe that there's a problem, I'm not going to know who's responsible for what activity. Like, if I come across an emergency on the street tomorrow, I don't have to work out, is it the police, is it the ambulance, is it whatever? I just ring 999 and they work that out for me, right? I know I'm simplifying it, but... And the only reason I'm saying that is because enforcement only works if it's clear, if it's straightforward. If it's overly complex, and just from what you've described, it sounds like a very complex system. So first of all, will there be a legal obligation on the management authorities to ensure compliance? And for people who aren't the management authorities, are we going to design a system, because there's going to be lots of interest in this, and what we all want is compliance. How do we make sure that people can engage and interact with that, from the regular citizen to the small community group to the mid-sized NGO to Oireachtas members, for example? Could I add to that then as well? You know, under the Maritime Planning Act, the local authority is responsible for the 3 miles out, I think. I would imagine 99% of these observations that may be made by members of the public that they see is going to be from the land or close to the shore. That possibly the local authority will inform. If you ring the local authority and say, I think there's something going on here in terms of environment or planning infringements, local authority are probably best placed to know that's a designated site or that's not, that is a permitted activity. You know, they'll give you that indication. I'm just wondering, is that the best route to go on this? Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Deputy. I think it's something that we'll take with that away and consider that further, how we would articulate that. I suppose in our thinking on this, we had, through the participation and I suppose the publicity around a site, so the signage, I think we talked about in your absence, about how you would have signage around a site. These are for coastal sites, particularly, as I said, over the horizon. There's a very discrete number of people involved, and the monitoring systems for those can be much more specific to those. So, you know, satellites and radio signals and things like that. But for those coastal sites, we had originally thought that, you know, a wider level of information or awareness by the public that this is a marine protected area you're looking at. This is the list of things we're protecting for these reasons. This is who you should contact if things go wrong. But how you code that into legislation might be difficult, but the point you make, I think, is one we would take away and consider, because viewing it from the point of view of non-compliance and someone who wants to raise an alert around non-compliance is maybe something that we haven't fully described, and maybe that would be a useful thing to help.
And again, just another analogy. Another government committee yesterday was dealing with short-term letting. We dealt some years ago with new planning regulations for change of use, which was very straightforward, right? And the rules are very clear. If you short-term let for a specific period of time in a particular kind of building, you need a change of use planning application in certain locations. The problem was the enforcement regime was never thought through. So we have very, very clear regulations and no meaningful way of enforcing. And now government is trying to, 3 years later, put in place a new enforcement regime. So I suppose I'm only saying that by way of saying the greater thought that's put into actually how we have an enforcement regime that will actually work in the real world is really, really key. And again, I think there's lots of good learning from things that haven't worked on terrestrial planning again in this. And I do think one of the reasons why our building control doesn't place an obligation on state agencies to enforce compliance is because it would then place a liability on the state. Right? So in building control legislation, this is a matter of dull record, was passing through the Oireachtas many, many years ago. It was very explicit that we couldn't have compliance ultimately falling back on a state agency, because if something goes wrong, the state is on the hook. As taxpayers now know, even though the state wasn't on the hook, the state is on the hook and has to pay the bill. So actually there's an argument to say that it's not just about having a standard, but who is legally mandated to ensure compliance. Because if somebody isn't legally mandated, it's then left to those complicated procedures. And they don't work, is our experience on land. Even with the best will in the world or the best design intention. It's just an observation.
Yeah. I was going to, I can reply if you want, but it's an observation.
Absolutely, if you have a
No,
thought.
it's just in the design of this. I mean, when you're creating a power like this, how do you consolidate? I mean, the consolidation of power in one minister, for example, is often a difficult thing to achieve. So if you look at how we've tried to structure the management recommendation, plan, reporting and compliance with the plan, then this graduated approach to enforcement, so that you do then eventually have this single instructing power. You must do it this way, or it must be done like this. So we have attempted to do that, but in a way that allows the current competent bodies to retain their competence. And just like any environmental standard, they have an obligation then to comply with that environmental standard as it affects them. So, that's the nature of the system.
Yeah. And I'm not even making the case for a single authority or agency, right? Because again, I understand it's not that straightforward. What I am making the case for is particularly at the early stages, where there are multiple agencies or authorities, if there is one place where anybody can go to be told what is the appropriate, and Stephen's point is a good one, right? Which is, it may be that there's a single point of contact in a geographical area who can then divert you to, whether it's any one of those agencies. Because I don't have a PhD, and I would struggle to even repeat the configuration of agencies that you've just outlined. So I can imagine a member of the public who, it's not that they're not an expert, but they just won't know this terrain.
Thank you, Deputy O'Brien. Deputy Gould, I was just about to wrap it up, but you just
I'll be very
managed
brief.
to get in just in time, so please
I'll
go
be
ahead.
very brief, Chair. I suppose, and listen, apologies, just running in and out of meetings, and I know if some of these questions have been answered. I suppose the enforcement issue was raised earlier on by a number of, by Deputy O'Callaghan, and that's something that I would have concerns about in relation to whose role it will be. So,
We've just spent about the last
Did you
50 minutes on that subject. Yeah.
all right. Well, listen.
But we've now
thanks.
covered it, and we will. Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose the other question then in relation to Head 14, did you discuss that?
Deputy O'Brien raised it in the non-compliant sites pre-existing.
Well, what we'll do is, listen, I'll look at the transcripts, myself and Owen, and we'll talk, and hopefully next week we can come back with more questions.
And just then, for your benefit, Deputy Jules, because I'm not sure if you're here, what we said, next week we're meeting sort of user groups, and the following week, following Thursday, we're meeting the environmental groups. And then what we might seek is a briefing session, which is a week of feedback. And then we would like to proceed then to compile our PLS report to allow the bill to be put together. Is that okay?
Yeah, and I think I heard while I was listening about the 3 pillars on access to justice. I think that was raised as well. So listen, we'll look at your comments, and hopefully we can work together, and we'll talk again next week.
Thanks, Deputy Gould. I appreciate that. So, Mr. Cronin and Dr. O'Kyla and Dr. Higgins and Mr. O'Connor, thank you for your engagement here today. It's been really helpful and informative for us, but not just in this 3-hour session we've had now, for the considerable work you've put into getting this to the stage it's at, and really do appreciate it. And the committee will not delay in acting our part so we can enact this and protect our seas and restore our precious marine environment. So thank you very much for your attendance today. Meeting is adjourned until Tuesday the 31st at 11 a.m. Gurmagh.